I think the Hizmet'e schools around the world in 160 countries are making an important contribution to democracy simply by virtue of their existence and by virtue of the training and educating of, thousands of students who would not be the recipients of a modern education and a religious education had those schools not existed. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I'm also an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics, and I teach in the broad area of political theory, comparative politics, focusing on the contemporary Middle East. My view on the question of interfaith dialogue and Muslims dialoguing and being in conversation with non-Muslims, I think that's a very important activity. Largely because we are living in a globalized world. We have to learn how to get along with one another. There's many different groups who are inspired by their own religious faith. They're interested in engaging with and interacting with other groups. And when it comes to Muslim communities, particularly in the West, there has been often an absence or a reluctance of Muslim communities to come out of their own small community organizations and to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and to interact with other faith communities. So one of the things that I've seen in all the cities in North America that I've lived in is this precise desire and focus and interest on behalf of the Hizmet'e movement to engage in interfaith dialogue. And so just bringing people together in the same space, to have a meal, to listen to a speech, is an important first step. But I want to highlight it's only a first step, because I think one of the problems that I have with interfaith dialogue is that people come together and they all sort of, invoke and recite the most positive interpretations of their own religion, and they tend to deal with topics that are not controversial, that are not difficult to deal with, and they avoid the difficult subjects. It's really the difficult subjects that are causing the problems. So I think as a first step, bringing people together. So just let me cite one example. I think when it comes to interfaith dialogue, I'm strongly in favor of it. But when Muslims and Jews, for example, get together, you often will hear in these dialogues and in these discussions, look, let's separate, leave aside, do not discuss the question of Israel-Palestine. I have a problem with that, because for Muslims, the question of Israel-Palestine is an identity issue. It is central to the broader contemporary problem that we're having between the Muslim world, and in this case, the State of Israel, and those American Jewish communities in North America that identify with the State of Israel. It's the number one key issue. To leave that off the agenda forever avoids what separates us. I realize at the first meeting when Muslims and Jews get together, you can't talk about Israel, but you have to put it on the agenda somewhere, or else you're really not, I think, dealing with the difficult issues that separate communities. And I think, in North America, if you interact with different religious communities, you'll see there's a lot of interest. There's much more interest among Christians and Jews to dialogue with Muslims than there is in the other direction. And so by taking a lead, when the Hizmet'e movement takes a lead in reaching out and bringing Muslim Jews together, it makes a contribution. And I wish other Muslim communities from different ethnic groups will learn from the Hizmet'e movement and engage in these types of interfaith conversations, because I think they are important. I think the emphasis on education by the Hizmet'e movement is very important. When I went to Turkey 5 years ago, I actually had a chance to visit one of these Hizmet'e-run schools, and I was very impressed by the facilities, by the students that were there. And what was interesting was when I went to Turkey, I was on a tour of Turkey, and the tour guide was someone who was very critical of the Hizmet'e movement, did not like Fethullah Gulen, was a staunch and harsh secularist. But he was saying that he has a son who's about to go to school, and him and his wife, even though they're harsh secularists, were struggling with the idea as to whether they should send their son to a Hizmet school because it was the best school in their neighborhood and it was the best place they could get an education. And that's sort of what I've heard from anyone who's been involved with these Hizmet-run schools. They're high quality, they teach a modern education, they have a strong emphasis on ethical values, and also on religious teaching. And I think that's what most parents want for their children. They want to send them to good quality schools, and so if the Hizmet organization is providing that type of schooling, then all credit to them. And we can see even in the case of Turkey, people who don't like religion or don't like the Hizmet movement are sending their kids or thinking of sending their kids because they're providing a good service to the community in which they live in. I think the Hizmet schools around the world in 160 countries are making an important contribution to democracy simply by virtue of their existence and by virtue of the training and educating of thousands of students who would not be the recipients of a modern education and a religious education had those schools not existed. So in that sense, in and of itself, by virtue of raising living standards, by teaching students a modern education, you are contributing in a very significant way to the process of democracy. But of course, democracy requires much more than simply education. But if you're going to use that measure, then I think those schools that have been established by the Hizmet movement are making a contribution to democracy. If you look at the theoretical and academic literature on democracy, one of the factors that often is considered to be democratic enhancing is higher levels of modernization, and by modernization, higher levels of literacy. In other words, there's an idea that the more that people have higher levels of education, the more they're literate, the more they can read, the more they can participate, the more they can sort of contribute to the political development of this. So there is a link, If you look at the, the factors that produce democratic transitions, one of the factors is the existence of higher levels of literacy, a sizable middle class, and those are generally considered to be, factors that enhance democracy. So that's an established sort of general principle if you talk to anyone who knows anything about the history of democracy or democratic theory. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. India, for example, is the largest democracy, some people say. There's a lot of illiterate and poor people. So you don't necessarily have to have that, but it's considered to be a democracy-enhancing feature if you have more education and you have more educated people. It prevents the rise of authoritarian dictators. I mean, what's happening today as I speak, where everyone is following the news in Egypt. Egypt has a lot of people, but a lot of illiterate people, a lot of poor people. And it's not a coincidence that the military coup that took place last year in Egypt was supported by a lot of average Egyptians who, I think, had they been higher educated, would not have supported the subversion and the uprooting of democracy last year in Egypt. Number one, I think I'm not surprised to hear that the Hizmet movement is involved in charitable activity that's meant to reduce poverty. Anyone familiar with Islamic norms and values knows that the idea of charity, of zakat, of caring about the poor and the poverty-stricken, weaker segments of society is a religious obligation. And that's not unique to Islam. If you look at a lot of charities, a lot of sort of organizations that are involved in humanitarian relief, development work, a lot of them come out of a religious background, motivated by very similar impulses that I think the Hizmet movement here is that there is a connection between your religious obligations and reducing human suffering. So I'm not surprised by that. And so, we have to acknowledge that at least those of us living in North America, we are living a very privileged and very comfortable lifestyle. There's a lot of people in different parts of the world who don't have the opportunities, the standard of living, the ability to make ends meet. And so to hear that the Hizmet movement is working in this area, it doesn't surprise me, and I think it's an important contribution. I have a very positive impression of the Hizmet movement's going beyond just interfaith dialogue and actually doing something. That's another one of the criticisms that I have of interfaith dialogue. People come together and they all present their best face forward, and everyone sort of is happy, and they sort of talk about non-controversial things. I would like to see interfaith dialogue to be the first step, but I think what also has to happen is you have to actually do something. You have to be actively involved in resolving or contributing to solving human problems. So to hear that people are organizing, in this case the Hizmet movement, and going into the field where there is poverty, where there's suffering, where there's there's a number of important needs that need to be addressed, and you're trying to actively use the opportunity and the resources that you have to address human suffering, I think is a very important, goal. In fact, that's what I think the goal of interfaith dialogue should be. It should bring people together, not simply to sort of make themselves feel good, but is to actually do something concrete. And so whether it's in your own community or whether it's in another part of the world, and I think it's even more impressive, in my view, when someone from a religious organization or community is going out and doing relief work for people who have a different religious faith than yours. That, I think, is a higher standard of a commitment to universal values that, I think is very impressive and inspires me.